Good evening. It's really good to be here. So I'm Dr. Penny Atkins. I'm a researcher at the University of Brighton Advanced Engineering Centre, where my work focuses on reducing the environmental impact of transport, particularly low carbon, low emissions propulsion. In previous events, you've had presentations of types of transport intervention. So tonight I'm going to talk about how we can understand how effective these interventions or different technologies might be in a holistic way. So we know the downsides to our current transport system. I cycle in Brighton and they're pretty apparent on a day-to-day basis. Congestion and air quality are a big issue. On a more global scale, greenhouse gas emissions from transport continue to pose a really big threat to our future. So how do you decide what is good? Things aren't always quite what they seem. So to choose a different example, let's think about plastic bags versus paper and cloth. So plastic bags are bad, right? Because they stay in the environment for a long time and affect the wildlife. However, if you think about this on an energy to produce the bag basis, which what the graph shows at the bottom right of the slide, you'll see that paper uses more energy to produce than plastic, and cloth over 130 times more energy than plastic. Plus, you need to think about considerations around the forest that you need to chop down to make a paper bag and the environment that you need to grow the cotton. So it's not quite as straightforward as it might seem. So the UN has a set of sustainable development goals that we can use to help us think about meaningful questions that we might use to evaluate different types of transport technology. So these goals were adopted by the United Nations in 2015, really as a universal call to end poverty, protect the planet and ensure everybody enjoyed peace and prosperity. So we can use them to develop questions to help us to understand transport and its effect on our society. 3, 12 and 13 are very particularly relevant. So goal 3, good health and well-being, 12, responsible consumption and production, and 13, climate impact. So if we think about goal 3 first, does the technology contribute to good health and well-being? There are a number of ways we can think about this. So an obvious factor is air quality. So what happens to the in-use emissions? Are they better or worse with the technology? Active travel, does this make walking or cycling easier, for example? So the picture I've included on the slide shows the tram system in Edinburgh that was installed to reduce transport impact there, but unfortunately had an impact in terms of cyclist safety. And then we need to think about how inclusive it is. So, for example, is it accessible to everybody? So thinking about people who are less able, or perhaps people with young children. And how about the cost? Is it really inclusive? Because we know that social exclusion can have a really big impact on our mental health. So now let's think about transport in terms of their climate effect. So this is goal 13, climate action. So life cycle analysis thinks about greenhouse gas emissions over the whole vehicle life cycle. At the moment, the legislation that our government uses to assess the effect of transport, particularly cars here, only thinks about what comes out of the tailpipe, when in reality you need to think about what emissions during production and recycling, as well as the fuel or electricity if you're an electric vehicle. So how much energy and emissions do you generate when you're producing the fuel? So the next slide shows a graph which is looking at the life cycle emissions. So you'll see that there is emissions from vehicle production in use. So in other words, the fuel and the tailpipe emissions and the vehicle end of life. So while the vehicle end of life has a really small effect, you'll see that production and in-use emissions are really significant. And what I've included here is some bars which show the greenhouse gas emissions for conventional engines, and then battery electric vehicles, and on the far right hand side hydrogen fuel cells. And you'll see, if you can read the words, which I hope you can, that the fuel makes a really big difference to how environmentally friendly that technology is. So if you look at the first bar, which is diesel fossil fuel, you'll see that it's much greater than the third bar along, which is a biofuel, so biodiesel. And similarly for hydrogen. So for a hydrogen fuel cell, where we're using hydrogen that's produced in the way it is right now, so from the UK electricity grid, which is not all renewable electricity, and steam methane reforming, it has a much greater impact on our environment than if you use entirely renewable electricity, which is the far right-hand bar. So it's very important to think about the fuel that we're using for our transport technology. Just because it's a fuel cell or an electric vehicle doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be greener than your diesel vehicle, particularly if your diesel vehicle has a biofuel. So I'll finish by thinking about goal 12. This is about responsible consumption, so really looking at how our choices affect the environment. And so the graph on this slide shows the differences in carbon footprint of travel per kilometre for different types of transport. So the top bar, you won't be surprised, is domestic flight at 255, and the bottom bar, right at the bottom there, Eurostar, so in other words international rail, is just 6 grams per kilometre. So in other words, it makes a really big difference. So if we're travelling to London, for example, down here, you'll get by far fewer emissions if you choose to go by national rail at 41 grams than you would do if you drove there in your car at 192. So my challenge really is, when you're thinking about local transport, think in a holistic way to make sure that you get the best overall benefit, and also think about our own behaviour to understand the effect that we have and what we can do about that. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions in a moment.